Relations between the United States and the United Kingdom from 1860 to 1941 by Becky Ramsberg and Nicholas Krywicki. During the American Civil War, Britain was forced to become involved when the Confederacy hoped to gain their favor, along with France's favor, to gain the Confederacy their own independence. With the support of Britain and France, the Confederacy hoped that they could overcome the North. However, at the beginning of the war, Britain issued a proclamation of neutrality, hoping not to get involved in the fighting. Despite this, the Confederacy expected Britain would enter the war on the south side to protect the cotton that came from the south. The Southerners felt confident, but failed at diplomacy with the British, costing them the support of the British troops. While the Civil War was going on, British society was divided into two sides, people that supported the North and people that supported the South. The Northern supporters were more against slavery than they cared about the Confederacy's independence, and the Southern supporters felt the opposite way. However, the overall British feel was that Britain was completely against slavery, having banned it itself, but they did feel that the Confederacy had the rights for independence on its own. In 1861, an event occurred called the Trent Affair. This was where a northern warship intercepted a British mail ship that was carrying two Confederate envoys that were going to Britain to ask for Britain's aid. Britain was furious at this because it violated their free seas. The North felt pressured by Britain and immediately released the Confederate envoys. Overall, the Civil War eventually led to the United States, or the Northerners in the United States, resenting Britain in the Civil War because of how they acted. Later on in the 1800s, industry competition began. Americans began taking over the shoe market and many other markets in Britain itself. Britain had always held a free market system where there was pure free trade, but felt pressure as more British exports and imports lessened and were being overtaken by the United States' own imports and exports. In 1859, the Venezuelan crisis occurred. Britain and Venezuela were fighting over borders, and the U.S. stood with Venezuela. The United States did this to improve relations with Latin America, but it did hurt relations between the United States and Britain. The Great Rapprochement. The U.S. and UK social and political objectives began converging after that point from 1895 to World War I. World War I. The U.S. began the war neutral, but was trading with Britain. Britain's financial crisis in 1916 showed that maybe the British would lose. The U.S. declared war the following year in 1917, sending millions of soldiers to Europe to aid. In 1921, the British wanted to get closer with the U.S., even during the war, and continued their alliance with Japan. Seeing that Japan was a big enemy to the U.S., Britain decided breaking the alliance with Japan was more important than keeping that alliance and having lesser relations with the United States. In 1930, the U.S. raised tariffs, and in retaliation, the British also raised their own tariffs against the U.S. and other countries, giving special trade preferences to Commonwealth U.S. demanded. Special preferences end in 1946 for a large loan. In 1933, Britain called for a worldwide London Economic Conference to help them out of depression. But the U.S. refused to cooperate and thus ended the London Economic Conference, therefore hurting British relations with the United States. The final major event in between these two countries occurred at the start of World War II. Our time period ends during the war, but at the beginning of the war, the United States was neutral as they were in World War I, while Britain and France themselves were still getting munitions from the United States. U.S. support was, in a sense, in Britain and France's favor. And in 1940, Roosevelt gave Britain and the Soviet Union aid, signed the Destroyers for the Bases Agreement, which let the United States rent British land and air bases in exchange for 50 old destroyers for the Royal Navy. The U.S. would eventually enter the war on their side, showing that the United States and Britain's relationship at this point could be described as a positive one.